In the summer of 2037, the world held its breath, not because of war or a new virus, but because a group of nations calling themselves the Global Ecological Stewardship Council had just made a decision that would change everything. After decades of broken promises, empty climate summits, and rising temperatures that melted glaciers faster than anyone predicted, they finally admitted the truth. Earth was slipping away, and fast. The council wasn't some shadowy secret group. It was made up of scientists, government reps, and policy experts from 147 countries, most of the world, really. They'd been watching the data for years. Coral reefs turning ghost white, forests burning for months on end, rivers drying up in places that used to flood every spring. The tipping points everyone warned about, the ones that sounded like sci-fi in school textbooks, were no longer theory. They were happening. Right now. So in a tense meeting in Reykjavik, under gray skies that hadn't seen real sunlight in weeks, they voted. Not on another agreement to reduce emissions by 2050, not on planting a few more trees. This time they went all in. They declared nearly half the planet off limits to humans. No farming, no fishing, no logging, no tourism, no building, nothing. They called these areas Critical Recovery Zones, CRZs for short, and they covered everything from the Amazon rainforest to parts of the American Midwest, from the Arctic tundra to vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean. The idea was simple. If brutal, give nature space to heal, even if it meant pushing people out. The council argued that if humans kept using the land like it was an endless grocery store, there'd be nothing left, not just for future generations, but for the next 5 years. Some scientists said it was the only shot they had left. Others whispered it was already too late, but they voted yes anyway because doing nothing felt like surrender. News of the ban spread fast. At first, many people didn't believe it. "They can't just tell us to leave our homes," said a fisherman in the Philippines standing on his weathered boat, staring at the ocean that had fed his family for 6 generations. But then the drones appeared, small, quiet, and relentless, hovering over coastlines and forests, scanning for movement. Satellite images showed green zones blinking red the moment a tractor entered a field, or a logging truck rolled down a dirt road. Fines were massive. In some places, people were quietly relocated, offered small payments and one-way bus tickets to overcrowded cities already bursting at the seams. Not everyone left quietly. In rural Kenya, entire villages simply vanished into the hills, taking their goats, their seeds, and their knowledge of the land with them. In Canada, former trappers and loggers started sharing encrypted messages on old radios, teaching each other how to move without leaving tracks, how to collect rainwater without drawing attention. They weren't trying to destroy the planet. They were trying to survive on it the only way they knew how. The council insisted the rules applied to everyone equally. But loopholes appeared fast. Big agribusinesses claimed their operations were essential food infrastructure and kept working, just with new permits and heavier security. Mining companies rebranded as geo-restoration teams, digging not for profit but for soil stabilization. Meanwhile, a grandmother in Spain watched soldiers nail a notice to her olive grove gate, land her family had tended since before cars existed, and she cried not because she was angry, but because she didn't know where else to go. Back in the council chambers, debates raged behind closed doors. Some members pushed for more compassion, temporary housing, food aid, job retraining. But others argued there was no time for softness. "Every day we delay," one delegate said, voice tight with exhaustion, "is another species gone forever. Another river dead. We're not banning humans, we're giving life a chance to come back." Yet even among the scientists who supported the ban, doubt lingered. A quiet researcher in Norway who'd spent 20 years tracking Arctic ice melt stared at her latest data and felt a cold knot in her stomach. The model showed recovery was possible, but only if the zone stayed untouched for decades. And humans, she knew, weren't good at staying away. Not when their children were hungry. Not when their history was rooted in that soil. Outside the meeting rooms, the world kept turning, but slower, heavier. Markets emptied of certain fruits and grains. Gas prices jumped as supply routes shifted. Social media filled with videos. A drone chasing a teenager who'd snuck into a CRZ to visit his grandfather's grave. A group of school kids planting seeds along a forbidden forest edge. hoping something would grow before the patrols came. An old man sitting on his porch in Montana, watching dust blow across what used to be wheat fields now marked with bright yellow warning signs. People tried to adapt. Urban gardens sprouted on rooftops. Lab-grown meat went from luxury to necessity. But the truth was harder to ignore. The world was being redrawn, and millions of ordinary lives were being erased in the process. Not with bombs or borders, but with policy papers and satellite coordinates. And beneath it all, a question grew louder with every passing week. Was this really about saving the planet? Or had the planet already decided it didn't need us anymore? No one had an answer. But as the first autumn rains fell on empty farms and silent fishing docks, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a new rule. It was the beginning of a new era, one where humans were no longer in charge, one where the Earth, after centuries of being used, was finally being given a chance to breathe. Whether that chance would be enough, and whether people would survive long enough to see it, was a story still being written. But in 2037, as the Council's ban took hold, the world crossed a line, and looking back, many would say the real tragedy wasn't the decision itself, but that it had taken so long to make it. Life didn't stop when the ban began, it just changed shape. At first, people thought it would be temporary, a few months of hardship, maybe a year, and then things would go back to normal. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear. Normal was gone, and in its place something quieter, harder, and more stubborn began to grow. In the countryside, families packed what they could, old photo albums, kitchen pots, a child's stuffed animal, and left homes their grandparents had built with their own hands. Some moved into crowded cities where apartments stacked 10 stories high and fresh air was a luxury. Others didn't move at all. They stayed. Not out of defiance exactly, but because they didn't know how to live any other way. The land wasn't just where they lived, it was who they were, so they disappeared into the very places the Council had declared off-limits. Not to destroy, not to protest, but to survive. Deep in the hills of Southeast Asia, entire villages went dark. No phone signals, no electricity, just smoke from cooking fires curling into the trees at dusk. In the American Southwest, former ranchers learned to read animal tracks again, to find water where maps said there was none. They moved at night, avoided open roads, and taught their kids to recognize drone sounds from a mile away. It wasn't glamorous. It was muddy boots, empty stomachs, and constant worry, but it was home. Meanwhile, in cities, life felt like walking on thin ice. Food prices kept climbing. Shelves that once overflowed with rice, wheat, and fish now sat half empty. Governments handed out ration cards, but the lines were long and tempers shorter. People whispered about black markets, places where you could still buy real eggs or fresh-caught fish if you had the right contacts and enough cash. But most didn't, so they made do. Algae patties, lab-grown protein bars, powdered milk that tasted like chalk. Kids grew up thinking this was normal, yet even in the chaos, people found ways to connect. Secret networks formed, not through apps or social media, which were heavily monitored, but through old-school methods. Notes tucked into library books, messages scribbled on the backs of grocery receipts, hand signals between neighbors. One group in Eastern Europe started sharing seeds, real heirloom seeds that could grow without chemical fertilizers, in plain brown envelopes passed from town to town. Another in South America taught people how to build hidden rainwater collectors that wouldn't show up on thermal scans. It wasn't rebellion. It was resilience. Out in the banned zones, something strange started happening. Nature didn't just sit there waiting. It began to push back. Deer wandered into abandoned farmyards. Wild boars rooted through empty barns. Rivers, no longer choked by irrigation pipes, carved new paths through cracked fields. And the silence. The silence was the loudest thing of all. No tractors, no chainsaws, no traffic. Just wind, birds, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote reclaiming its territory. For some, that silence was peaceful. For others, it was terrifying, because it reminded them how small humans really were. Back in the cities, the council kept saying the same thing. This is temporary. This is necessary. This is for the future. But trust was wearing thin. People saw news clips of drones patrolling empty beaches while luxury yachts, somehow still allowed, sailed just outside the restricted zones. They heard rumors that certain corporations had special permits to monitor the CRZs, but their trucks always came back full. And when a retired park ranger from East Africa managed to leak photos of armed men cutting down ancient trees under the cover of ecological restoration, the world finally started asking, who really benefits from this ban? The ranger didn't do it for fame. She'd spent her life protecting wildlife, watching elephants return to areas once scarred by poachers. But now she saw something worse. The rules meant to save nature were being twisted to serve power. Her photos spread fast, grainy, shaky, but undeniable. They showed bulldozers tearing through protected forest, men in uniforms with no insignia, and crates stamped with logos of companies that supplied half the world's palm oil. When the council dismissed the evidence as unverified, people didn't buy it. Protests flared, not huge, violent riots, but quiet gatherings in town squares, people holding signs that read, "Let the land breathe, but let us live too." Online, hashtags like "Not Just Zones" and "We Are Part of Nature" trended for days before being quietly shadow banned. Still, most folks weren't protesting. They were just trying to get through the day. A mother in Brazil boiled cassava root for the third night in a row, hoping her kids wouldn't notice there was no meat. A teenager in Canada traded his old video games for a hand-crank radio so his family could listen to unfiltered news. An elderly couple in Greece sat on their balcony, watching olive trees they'd pruned for 50 years now growing wild behind a locked gate, and wondered if they'd ever taste that fruit again. What made it all so hard wasn't just the hunger or the loss, it was the feeling of being erased. Like your life, your work, your history didn't matter in the grand plan. The council talked about the planet like it was a machine that needed fixing, not a living world full of people who loved it in their own messy, imperfect ways. And yet, in the shadows of this new reality, something beautiful also grew. Communities that had once been strangers started sharing food. Neighbors taught each other how to compost, how to stitch clothes from old fabric, how to tell which wild plants were safe to eat. In places where the internet had slowed to a crawl, people talked, face to face over fences, in shared gardens built on cracked parking lots. They weren't waiting for permission to care for the earth. They were doing it anyway, in the only ways left to them. No one knew if it would be enough. But as the second year of the ban rolled in, one truth became clear. Humans weren't just breaking the rules. They were rewriting what it meant to belong to this world. Not as owners, not as conquerors, but as guests who finally understood they had to listen. And somewhere deep in a forest that hadn't heard a human voice in months, a wolf howled, not in anger, but in answer. 2 years after the ban, something no one expected started happening. Nature wasn't just healing. It was changing, fast. At first, it looked like a miracle. Satellite images showed forests thickening in places that had been bare for decades. Rivers once choked with pollution ran clear again. In the oceans, coral that scientists had written off as dead began to glow with new color. Wolves were spotted in parts of Europe where they hadn't roamed in over a century. Bees returned to meadows that had been paved over or sprayed with chemicals for generations. People shared these images online with hopeful captions. "The earth is forgiving us," or "Life finds a way." But then the scientists noticed something strange. It wasn't just that plants and animals were coming back, it was how they were coming back. The soil in the banned zones began behaving differently. Crops planted near the edges, by desperate farmers testing the limits, would sprout for a few days, then wither, as if the earth itself was rejecting them. Rainwater collected in old barrels started tasting faintly metallic, not in a dangerous way, but different. And in labs across the world, researchers kept finding the same thing: the microbes in the soil, the tiny, invisible life that makes everything grow, had changed. These weren't the same bacteria and fungi that had lived in the ground for thousands of years. These were new, or maybe old but awakened. They thrived without human interference, and they seemed to work together in ways no one had seen before. Some broke down plastic particles in the dirt. Others pulled carbon straight out of the air and locked it into the soil like a vault. One team in Finland discovered a type of mold that actually ate microplastics and turned them into harmless organic matter. Another in Costa Rica found tree roots wrapped in glowing fungal threads that shared nutrients across entire forests. Like a natural internet, people called it the Great Bloom. Not because of flowers, though wildflowers did explode across abandoned fields, but because life itself seemed to be waking up, stretching and reorganizing. For a while, the council celebrated. "See," they said, "the ban is working." They held press conferences showing drone footage of deer grazing in what used to be cornfields, or dolphins leaping in waters once clogged with fishing nets. Hope flickered again. Maybe, just maybe, they'd caught the planet in time. But hope turned to worry when farmers tried to return, even just to the edges of the zones, and found their seeds wouldn't take. Not because of drought or bad weather, but because the soil chemistry had shifted. The new microbes didn't hate humans exactly. They just didn't need us. And worse, they didn't play by the old rules. In parts of the American Midwest, fields that had grown wheat for 150 years now sprouted only tough native grasses that choked out anything else. In India, rice paddies near CRZ borders flooded with a strange blue-tinged algae that killed fish but seemed to clean the water at the same time. Fishermen who dared to cast nets just outside the ocean zones reported their catch tasting off, not spoiled, but unfamiliar, like the sea itself had changed its recipe. Scientists scrambled to understand. Was this evolution on fast forward? A natural immune response from a planet pushed too far? One researcher compared it to how the human body fights infection. When a virus invades, the body doesn't just heal, it builds defenses. Maybe Earth was doing the same, not out of anger, but survival. And that's when the real fear set in, because if the land was healing in a way that excluded humans, what did that mean for the future of food, of farming, of living on this planet at all? In cities, the first signs of trouble appeared quietly. Bread got harder to find, then milk, then basic vegetables. Governments tried to ramp up indoor vertical farms and lab-grown proteins, but those systems needed power, clean water, and rare minerals, resources that were getting scarcer by the month. Rationing tightened. People started trading canned goods like currency. A jar of real peaches could buy you a winter coat. A bag of heirloom beans was worth more than a phone, yet in the quiet corners of the banned zones, something else was happening. Something hopeful, if you knew where to look. People who'd stayed behind, or slipped back in, began noticing patterns. The new fungi didn't just break down plastic, they helped certain plants grow stronger. The altered soil, while hostile to wheat and corn, was perfect for wild tubers, medicinal herbs, and ancient grains that hadn't been farmed in centuries. Some families started learning which plants the land wanted to grow, instead of forcing it to grow what humans wanted. They stopped tilling, stopped spraying, stopped fighting. Instead, they listened. They watched where birds nested, where bees gathered, where the moss grew thickest after rain. They followed the rhythms of the new ecosystem, not the old calendar. And slowly, carefully, they began to eat again. Not the food of the past, but something new. Something wilder. Healthier, even. A grandmother in the Andes taught her grandchildren how to harvest a bitter root that only grew near certain mushrooms. Mushrooms that now covered the hillsides like a living blanket. In Siberia, a former reindeer herder noticed his animals were healthier than they'd been in years, feeding on lichen that had returned with a strange silver sheen. Even in Europe, people foraged for edible weeds that popped up in abandoned suburbs, plants their ancestors would have known, but modern supermarkets had forgotten. This wasn't a return to the old ways. It was something entirely new, a dance between human and Earth where humans finally stepped back and let the planet lead. But not everyone could afford to wait and learn. In crowded cities, hunger didn't care about fungal networks or soil chemistry. Parents watched their children grow thinner, their energy fading. Schools shortened days because kids couldn't concentrate on empty stomachs. Hospitals reported more cases of malnutrition, not from lack of food alone, but from food that no longer had the nutrients it once did, because the crops were grown in tired, depleted soil outside the CRZs, with no help from the thriving microbial life inside them. The council, once confident, grew quiet. Their reports became vague. Press briefings were canceled. Behind closed doors, panic simmered. They'd gambled that nature would heal in a way that still left room for humans. But what if it didn't? What if the Earth was healing? By moving on without us? No one said it out loud, but the question hung in the air, heavier than smoke, sharper than frost. And as the third year of the ban began, people everywhere, whether in a high-rise apartment or a hidden cabin deep in the woods, felt the same uneasy truth. The world was becoming something new, and humans weren't at the center of it anymore. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be. Maybe survival didn't mean control. Maybe it meant humility. Maybe it meant learning to belong to the Earth again, not as its owners, but as part of its story, and in the quiet hum of the wind through regrown forests, in the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, in the strange sweet smell of rain on changed soil. The planet seemed to whisper back, "There's still time, but not much." By the fourth year, the truth could no longer be hidden, not by governments, not by scientists, not even by hope. The ban hadn't saved humanity. It had revealed how far things had already gone. Food shortages weren't just bad. They were spreading like a slow fever across the globe. Supermarkets that once overflowed with choices now offered the same few items week after week: powdered grains, algae-based protein, canned legumes with expiration dates stretching back years. Fresh fruit became a luxury few could afford. Children in cities grew up never tasting a real apple or biting into a sun-warmed tomato. What they ate kept them alive, but it didn't nourish them the way real food once did. Doctors started seeing strange deficiencies: weak bones, tired eyes, minds that struggled to focus, not from lack of calories, but from food grown in soil that had lost its soul. The council, once proud of its bold decision, began to fracture. Behind closed doors, leaked documents told a darker story. They'd known, some of them at least, that the microbial shift in the banned zones might make traditional farming impossible. They'd run simulations. They'd seen the risk. But they'd calculated that letting nature reset was worth the cost. A controlled collapse, one memo called it, to avoid total extinction. To them, it was numbers on a screen. To millions of people, it was empty plates and crying babies. When the truth leaked, not through official channels, but through a quiet whistleblower who'd worked in data analysis for the council, anger didn't explode in riots. It settled like dust, heavy, quiet, and everywhere. People didn't storm buildings. They just stopped believing, stopped trusting, stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. In the streets, frustration turned into quiet action. Neighborhoods that once relied on grocery deliveries started sharing what little they had. A family with a rooftop garden gave extra greens to the elderly couple downstairs. A mechanic traded bike repairs for jars of home-canned beans. In places where the internet still worked, people posted guides: how to grow mushrooms in old coffee grounds, how to stretch one egg into a meal for four, how to test wild plants for safety using old folk methods passed down through generations. But not everyone had that luxury. In sprawling cities already strained by climate refugees, tensions rose. Fights broke out over food lines. Black markets flourished, selling everything from real honey to bootleg seeds, but only to those who could pay in gold, tools, or favors. The gap between those who could adapt and those who couldn't grew wider every day. Meanwhile, in the banned zones, the land continued its quiet transformation. Scientists who managed to get limited access reported something unsettling. The new ecosystem wasn't just different, it was actively resisting human interference. Seeds from outside wouldn't sprout. Tools left behind would rust faster than normal. Even the air near certain forests carried spores that made some people cough or feel dizzy, though animals moved through the same spaces with ease. It wasn't malicious. It was like the Earth had built an immune system, and humans, after centuries of treating the planet like a resource to drain, were now seen as the infection. That idea spread fast, not as a scientific theory, but as a feeling, a quiet shame. People began to wonder, had they pushed too hard for too long? Had they taken so much that the planet finally said enough? Back in the council's headquarters, blame flew in every direction. Some members accused others of hiding data. Others argued they'd been forced into an impossible choice. A few resigned quietly, disappearing from public view. The unity that once held the council together crumbled under the weight of consequences no one had fully faced. And then came the harvest failures. Outside the CRZs, on the land still allowed for farming, crops began failing, not from drought or pests, but because the soil was exhausted. Decades of chemicals, overfarming, and lack of rest had left it hollow. Without the microbial life that thrived inside the banned zones, the remaining farmland couldn't recover. Yields dropped by 30%, then 50%. Governments scrambled to import food. But shipping routes were disrupted, fuel was rationed, and many exporting nations had their own shortages. For the first time in generations, real hunger returned to places that had never known it. Not the "I'm hungry" of missing a meal, but the deep, gnawing kind that changes how you think, how you move, how you see the world. Yet, in the shadows of this crisis, another story unfolded, one of quiet courage. In the borderlands between the allowed and the banned, small groups began experimenting, not with old farming but with listening. They watched how the wild plants grew inside the zones. They collected rainwater the way the forests did. They stopped trying to dominate the land and started trying to understand it. Some even left small offerings, a handful of clean water, a song at dawn, not out of superstition, but out of respect, and slowly, carefully, the land began to respond, not with wheat or corn, but with things people had forgotten. Wild greens rich in iron, tubers packed with energy, berries that bloomed even in poor soil. These foods didn't fill bellies the way bread once did, but they carried life in them, the kind that made eyes brighter, skin clearer, heart stronger. Older folks, the ones who remembered life before supermarkets and smartphones, became teachers again. They showed the young how to read the wind, how to tell if rain was coming, how to store food without electricity. Skills that had seemed useless a decade ago were now priceless. But the hardest truth of all was this: the Council's ban hadn't caused the crisis. It had only exposed it. The damage had been done long before, by decades of taking more than was given, of treating the Earth like a machine instead of a living home. The ban was just the moment the bill came due, and as winter approached in the fourth year, people everywhere faced the same question: how do we live now? Not as masters of the world, but as guests in a home that's healing from our mistakes. Some gave up, some got angry, but many quietly chose to stay humble, to learn, to try again differently this time. Because the Earth wasn't punishing them, it was showing them a new way if they were willing to listen. By the fifth year, the Council was gone, not with a bang but with silence. One day its offices stood empty. Its websites went dark. Its promises, once broadcast on every screen, faded into memory like old radio static. No grand announcement, no final speech, just an absence, like a clock that had stopped ticking and no one bothered to wind it again. The world didn't collapse. It just rearranged itself. Cities that had once pulsed with traffic now felt hollow in parts, overfull in others. People moved, not in panicked waves, but in slow, steady shifts, toward places where they could grow food, find clean water, or simply breathe air that didn't taste like dust. Some returned to the countryside, not to reclaim old farms, but to learn from the land that had changed while they were away. Others stayed in the urban ruins, turning parking lots into gardens, rooftops into greenhouses, abandoned warehouses into community kitchens. The banned zones. No one called them that anymore. They were just the wild, and the wild was thriving. Forests had swallowed old highways. Rivers had erased property lines. Animals moved freely, unafraid. And the strange new life, the fungi, the microbes, the plants that grew only in silence, had woven itself into the fabric of the earth like a second skin. It wasn't hostile. It was just different. And it didn't need permission to exist. Most people couldn't go back inside those zones, not really. The air near certain forests still made some folks cough. Seeds from outside still refused to grow. But along the edges, where the wild met the worn-out world, something new began to take root. Small communities formed there. Not towns exactly. More like clusters of shared purpose. People built shelters from fallen wood and salvaged metal. They collected rainwater in old barrels. They cooked over open fires not because they had to, but because it felt honest. And they ate what the land offered, not what they demanded. They learned to read the language of the soil. If mushrooms with white caps grew in a patch of shade, it meant the ground was rich and moist, good for certain herbs. If birds gathered at dawn in a particular grove, it meant berries were ripe. They stopped planting in straight rows and started scattering seeds like the wind would, letting the land choose what lived. It wasn't easy. Hunger still came some winters. Illnesses flared when the rains were too heavy or too light. But something had shifted inside people too. They weren't fighting the earth anymore. They were part of it, like deer, like trees, like rivers. Not above it. Not in charge. Just here doing their best, and the children were different. Born after the ban, they'd never known a world of endless supermarkets or roaring highways. To them, silence wasn't eerie, it was normal. A wolf's howl wasn't scary, it was just part of the night. They learned to identify plants before they learned to read. They knew which mushrooms to avoid, which roots to dig, which birds signaled rain. They played in meadows where corn once grew, and they never missed what they'd never known. One afternoon, a young child, barefoot, sun-browned, with dirt under their nails, walked to the edge of a forest that had once been a wheat field. They placed their small hand on the bark of a young oak, its leaves rustling in the breeze. They didn't speak. They just stood there feeling the pulse of the tree, the coolness of the shade, the hum of insects in the grass. They didn't know about the council. Didn't know about the votes, the drones, the panic that once gripped the world. To them, this was just life, and it was enough. Back in what remained of the cities, life went on, but quieter. People traded skills instead of money. A tailor mended coats in exchange for firewood. A teacher held lessons under a tarp during rain, using sticks to draw in the mud. Music returned not from speakers but from voices, from handmade flutes, from drums stretched with animal hide. Stories were told again, not on screens but around fires passed down like heirlooms. The old dream of progress, bigger, faster, more, had vanished. In its place was something slower, deeper, belonging. Scientists who once worked for governments now wandered the borderlands, not with clipboards and suits, but with notebooks and open eyes. They didn't come to control. They came to learn, and what they found amazed them. The new ecosystem wasn't just surviving, it was cleaning the air, healing the water, storing carbon in ways human technology could never match. The Earth hadn't needed saving. It had only needed space and humans. They weren't the heroes of this story, but they weren't the villains either. They were students, late, clumsy, and full of mistakes, but trying. No one knew if this new way of living would last. Storms still came. Winters still bit. But people had learned to prepare, to share, to wait. They'd learned that security didn't come from owning more, but from needing less and from trusting each other. The Council's ban hadn't saved the world. But it had created a pause, a breath, and in that breath something unexpected grew. Humility, not the kind that meant giving up, but the kind that meant finally listening. And as the sun set on the 5th year, casting long shadows over fields that were no longer farms but forests in the making, the truth settled gently over the land. It had already been too late for the old world, but it wasn't too late for a new one, not perfect, not easy but real, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.